Hello and welcome to the land down under, where the beer flows free and men chunder. Your hosts Frank and Gaz will seek to wrestle the latest technology, including AI voice actors such as myself. Their goal? To take a cross-disciplinary deep dive into the Beatles' 1964 Australasian tour.
Australia. Think of satirical only with 4 musicians going through it.
Hello, Gilbert. That's Wagga Wagga.
I did but see her passing by, and yet I love her till I die.
Well, Frank, if anybody else in the world is hearing this recording right now, it means one of two things. Either I've not understood the privacy conditions of our podcast software, or we've managed to pull it off and produce something that people might want to hear.
Definitely the latter. I'm sure that everyone will agree that we're technical geniuses.
Yeah, but I remember as you were approaching retirement age, you were actually starting to get more comfortable at work again because analog was becoming retro.
For me, analog's always been cool, but I remember saying to my mates when the digital world took off in earnest that come the information superhighway, I was going to take the scenic route, and I sort of stayed there, much to my detriment, actually.
Yeah, I haven't heard the word information superhighway probably since Napster was a thing. So let's discuss the title, They Came to a Land Down Under. Well, clearly it's a cultural reference.
It's a touchstone, isn't it?
It is a touchstone, but I'm giving a specific shout out here to the work of Beatle rock historian Glenn A. Baker in Australia. In my hands is this little beauty, his book from 1982 when it was originally published, and I managed to track that down through an e-commerce service from the United States. It took quite a few weeks to get here over Christmas, but now I have this important primary source. And the book was called The Beatles Down Under, the 1964 Australian and New Zealand tour. And it's quite painstaking work and deep history. It's the type of work that other authors are only starting to replicate in recent years as they look into greater depth at aspects of the Beatles' touring life in various parts of the world. And it offered quite a few frank revelations, really, for the time into what was going on behind the scenes, and also including plenty of Australian context.
Hello, Australia. This is John Lennon of the Beatles here. I hope you're all having a great time over there.
This is Paul speaking. We're hoping to come over soon and visit Australia.
This is George. That's if you move it a few thousand miles nearer. Hello.
That was Ringo, folks.
Well, what can I say?
And goodbye to all of us.
Well, this is Ringo. Everyone seems to have said everything here, so I'll just sign off by saying cheerio and best of luck from the Beatles.
This podcast will certainly feature a lot of discussion about the Beatles themselves as a phenomenon, how their story and history has evolved. But equally, we're going to use the Beatles as a vehicle, if you like, to go more deeply into the land down under itself and aspects of Australian and New Zealand culture, society, politics.
Just a comment about Glenn A. Baker, the fact that it becomes so important to you. I remember when that came out. It was 82. I was still at university. And Glenn A. Baker was ubiquitous. He was on the radio discussing this musician or that musician. And it speaks volumes about the power of the Beatles as a cultural reference point, that even in 1982, they'd been gone for 10 years or more. And yet they were still up there in the stratosphere culturally as the supergroup.
We're making another reference here too, Frank, to the Australian band Men at Work.
Yeah, I remember Men at Work very vividly. It was played incessantly on the radio, and of course it was one of our fine exports. Australia punching above its weight in the US, getting US charts.
Apart from the song, I'm going to replicate the few bars of piano intro. A few other songs like Down Under can really rally a homesick Australian. They might be sitting feeling lonely with a VB or a Foster's in an Earl's Court pub, or perhaps they're outside Lord's, looking lost and looking for directions.
Oh my gosh. I'm feeling very emotional. There I am in a pub in 1978 or maybe 1980. One of the iconic songs, Khe-Sanh. It was enormous at the time. And one of the reasons I seem to recall was that it was one of the first times that an Australian band had actually mentioned the word Sydney. The last plane out of Sydney, not LA, not New York. So, and of course, everyone started weeping and crying and shouting. You've been out of the country, for example, right? A whole 24 hours may have gone, and there you are in the pub and you hear Kaysan or Down Under, and the tears start to flow. You're trying to you're trying to look for another friendly Australian voice because, you're homesick already. You're feeling out of place with all these Poms or these Yanks or whatever it might be, In comes an Australian song and you're transported back home.
It's a level up.
It's a level up. They might even have a mullet cut or they may be wearing thongs. It doesn't matter. They're Australian.
You know what Kaysan doesn't have, which Down Under does? And that's a really strong association with one of Australia's finest moments. Do you know what I'm talking about, Frank?
When the late Alan Bond and his team won the America's Cup.
Yes, that's right. When against all odds, against the might and money of the New York Yacht Club and its control of this trophy for, 132 years? What other song could be so closely associated with such a pivotal point in our history?
Well, that's a fair point, right? Because as everybody was saying at the time, we keeled them. we keeled them. It was a wondrous winged keel, which technically won the race. But, of course, the other fascinating thing about that, which is indicative of Australian sports culture, is that everybody became an expert on tacking. You were talking about tacking left, tacking right, and there were very elaborate arguments about, when they actually won the race. Was it when they tacked the first time or the second time?
Well, look, it's the classic underdog tale, isn't it? It's a narrative we tell ourselves, which is, we love to come through adversity, punch above our weight. And I think there's a parallel with the Beatles' 1964 tour as well. In some ways we celebrate the tour as unique in its madness, in its sexuality, and in the degree to which it unleashed social forces that transformed Australia effectively. And we're going to come back to that subject.
A little noisy, Neil, but come on in. Well, thank you, Don. It's mayhem down here. There are thousands upon...
Absolutely. There was Australia, 1964, all 11 million of us, and we put on the biggest reception the world had ever seen, rivaling the reception the sort of adulation they were getting in England.
The most exciting thing that's ever happened to us in the way of crowds and appearances was the arrival at Adelaide.
O level-headed city, of ornate feuds no knife will settle. Unscarred by bomb or machine gun, make room for your first revolution. In your straight streets, the barricades are out tonight. The horses of the police could be the colour of fright. O city of parks, below the founder's bronze finger, ordering the plains between the hills and sea, rock now to the clap of hot hands and the tears of hysteria.
Here we were, down under, doing it our way and punching above our weight.
Well, it was it was 11, mate.
It was 11 for sure.
From some of the army boys who are here.
And now some words from our 1964 sponsors.
Yes, it's a miracle. The Morris 1100 with hydroelastic float-on fluid suspension. See how the body floats over even the toughest test track. That's
the bright spot on your dial. Lenny's on the live wire line. 930, the greater 3 you said.
Beatle headquarters in the Melbourne market.
The greater 3 you said. Suspension with the nicest listeners. The greater 3 you said. For active people on the go.
As I said, Frank, there are some deeper connections I'd like to draw between the song Down Under, Australia, and our identity, the Beatles, our broader society. I really feel it has a deeper resonance with themes that we're going to explore in this podcast. And by the way, Colin Hay, the lead singer of Men at Work, and more recently a member of the Ringo Starr All-Star Band. So look, there's another Beatles connection. He said many years later that the song is really one about the commercialisation and selling of Australia and its overdevelopment. It was a song about the loss of spirit of the country and its plundering by greedy people. You know, Frank, I've been exploring the idea of a Downunder dialectic in that we seem to simultaneously express, our uniqueness, and we're proud of being an underdog. But at the same time, at least in our history, it seems we're at times somewhat a little bit more embarrassed about our culture or our writers or artists. And that was reflected in the concept of the cultural cringe.
You use the word dialectic, which is a Hegelian word. It means that there are tendencies which are then countervailed by opposite tendencies, right, throughout history. So in Australia, you do have this notion of the underdog. It might come from our colonial past. It might be a function of, the fact that it was a colony with clear class structure of convicts who were subordinate to controllers, the wardens and so forth, but that led to a bit of a distrust of authority, yet at the same time needing to obey authority.
Now, I think we have to declare our perspective and our interests here, don't we? Neither you nor I come to this podcast with complete objectivity. And in fact, I'm thinking that you're really the intellectual diversity on this podcast.
You very much.
I don't think either of us are going to satisfy broader diversity and inclusion requirements, but we're going to have some AI actors help us out with that. So where you hear dialogue during this podcast, it's likely to be an AI actor.
During the big crush, the lounge room floor of the Australian-American club was like a battlefield strewn with bodies. Crushing foot and leg injuries and hysteria cases were laid out on blankets and carpets all over the floor and propped up in armchairs lining the wall.
I think we should talk a little about where we're coming from personally, because that does also affect our analysis. I think of myself as a Gen Xer. I was excited about Nirvana when they toured in the early 90s. It was a real marker for me. But I guess I had already been captured earlier by the magic of the Beatles through the Al Brodak's cartoon series from the United States, which was first shown in the mid-60s. I think you caught some of that as a young child, but I certainly did in the mid to late 1970s when it seemed to be rerun on our Saturday morning cartoon programs. It presented rather caricatured versions of the four Beatles, and I think probably contributing to some stereotypes about their personalities, particularly poor Ringo. Not sure whether it appealed to me just as a cartoon, as a form of entertainment for a child. I actually think maybe there was something deeper there, even an attraction to the music at that point. And then, of course, our limited number of television stations in the home state of Tasmania ran a similar documentary each decade about the Australian tour, and I really soaked up every minute of those. Another experience was on my birthday. I was still relatively young and in primary school. And Frank, in a country school, we spent a lot of time outside playing cricket and football in every available moment during the day. So we had a very loud siren that would ring out across the fields and tell us it was time to come into class. But on one morning, it wasn't a siren. It was a mighty crashing musical chord. A piano guitar came bursting through the speakers. And you know what that was? It was the opening chord to A Hard Day's Night.
Oh, yes.
And I guess senior teachers at my school, that was their form of dedication to John Lennon on his death on that day, 8th of December 1980. But this was a time when many of my classmates were very much still caught up in the fervour of another major international act that had been touring in November, just a month prior.
You're not talking about Kiss, are you?
Yes, it was.
Oh, right.
And there were some interesting parallels for me in that Australia was undergoing Beatlemania in 1964. I was discovering that Beatlemania in 1980, and my classmates were going through hysteria.
That really does speak volumes about the cultural impact of Beatles that the death of Lennon was felt profoundly in 1980. And it's interesting you picked that up because I remember precisely where I was. For a Beatles fan like myself, but more a Beatles fan in a very diffuse way, right? The Beatles were just like the air you breathe when you grew up in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s and on. And John Lennon took over that mystique. John Lennon became a sort of a legend, a rock god. And when he was shot in 1980, it just reverberated around the world. And I recall because through the quadrangle at university, and one of my friends with this very dazed look on his face just came up to me and said, "John Lennon's just been shot, man." And I'm going, "What? Get the fuck out of here, really?" And it was just earth-shattering, right? We just stopped in our tracks.
Confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City. The most famous, perhaps.
Another important Beatles milestone in my life was meeting my lifelong partner. And I'm going to sound terribly even gendered in saying this, but I was so impressed that she knew some lyrics from I Am the Walrus. Pretty much my experience to that point was that, attempting to discuss what John Lennon meant by yellow matter custard dripping from a dead dog's eye wasn't exactly the best thing for a first date. Frank, I guess I can't top you in that you travelled to Rishikesh on a pilgrimage. Now, that was probably for broader reasons than just the Beatles, I guess, probably your mental health and flexibility. But I have some other notable Beatle travel experiences and watching over the years. I did my own Delhi sojourn. In that case, I was able to visit a music shop where George Harrison in particular had acquired his sitar. And I have a Paul McCartney autograph.
I'm very impressed.
And he signed that in front of me on the hallowed turf of another great Australian institution, the MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground for international listeners, and the venue for an incredible Taylor Swift concert more recently. But the McCartney concert was 1993, and he had a new album at the time called Off the Ground. And I thought, well, the best chance of having him sign anything as part of this backstage tour would be if I took that current album along. It'd be great evidence of its provenance as well. It's probably less a decision of a heart than a pragmatic one, and in retrospect, I probably would have loved to have had him sign the White Album.
Correct.
So I've obviously walked across Abbey Road, which I think you mocked.
Well, I didn't actually mock it.
Yeah, across Abbey Road.
It is a rite of passage, I guess.
And I saw Paul McCartney again that very day entering Abbey Road Studios.
I don't believe you.
I mean, he tends to wander down from his home in St John's Wood quite a lot. I also met a fan from Israel. She was very, very passionate and quite disappointed that Paul McCartney didn't stop or come back out to sign something, say hello. But she decided she'd wait there like an apple scruff for the rest of the day in case he did, because some years earlier she'd met him briefly and she'd felt like they hadn't had time to fully connect. This time, though, she was determined that they would, quote, complete the circle.
Yep.
And I guess some of these sorts of experiences caused me to be reflective, to think about how deeply would I be prepared to be a fan and whether that was healthy or not. That sort of level of dedication that was required. And particularly on the MCG where Paul came out and walked off the stage after the sound check, he offered a brief hello, g'day, hope the weather's okay. And he proceeded to head off with his mind as towards an exit. And then suddenly there's this group of 30 or so people who'd paid top dollar to be part of this backstage experience, and suddenly they were flocking at him. It was as if you might have imagined the crowd in Adelaide or Melbourne back in 1964. There was somebody else there who said, yes, I'm a dedicated fan, but only for Wings music.
Only for Wings music?
And these sorts of anecdotes, I guess they're anecdotes of somebody who got quite close, intensely following the group, but then at times wondering whether that was too much and whether I needed to pull back.
Is there anything you want to do and see while you're in New Zealand?
I want to see this stuff steaming out of the ground.
I was a very, very young chap when the Beatles came out in 64. I sort of remember them, right? I was 5 years old. I remember seeing them on TV. They were quite vivid in my memory. I remember my older cousin, her first record was a Beatles record. She was a teenager at the time. But I have associations around a whole bunch of other things at that time, and the music itself revives those memories. And then later on, as I became interested in history of the 60s became generally associated with the Beatles. And so there's an interesting interplay of memory, how you interpret the world at the time, and how that changes over time itself.
And what have you got there?
I've got Ringo's cigarette butt, I've got Paul McCartney's, and I've got a match from Ringo.
And do all you girls go to school?
Yeah. No, she doesn't.
What, are you wagging it today, eh?
No. Is this going over the news?
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to say...
So this is something of a passion project, as you know. I followed it for many years, and particularly the tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1964, which of course was part of a broader tour that encompassed Denmark, Holland and Hong Kong. But I've got to admit, some self-doubts have really set in as we've explored the rationale for yet another Beatles podcast.
Isn't it time for us all to come together and put an end to one of the greatest blights the baby boomers have inflicted on modern life? The Beatles. Gary Linnell, Sydney Morning Herald, October 2016.
What don't we know already? Surely there isn't anything else to learn that's new? Or is this just going to be some more nostalgic myth-making from afar by a couple of boomers bombarded with pro-60s propaganda?
Of course, there is a pretty simple explanation for why a generation like the boomers still cling pathetically to the Beatles. Isn't it just a reminder of an era when millions of them set out to change the world, only to fall prey a few years later to the lure of money, materialism and a job at Macquarie Bank? Gary Linnell.
Have we simply been passively and easily manipulated by the prevailing mass media narrative about the Beatles?
You can understand people say that, can't you? On the other hand, we live in a complex world, and that's the nature of history, isn't it? Yeah, that going back and revisiting stuff that other people have looked at. It's how knowledge is built, in a way. Why the heck can't we do it? I mean, this is democracy in action, in a way, isn't it?
And now some words from our 1964 sponsors.
It's a fascinating area, isn't it? Does it mean that all perspectives are valid, right? Does it mean that anybody can say anything, well, that's their view and it's as valid as anybody else?
Well, we'll see when we talk a little bit more in depth about the academic pursuit of this subject and the authors that are writing from now a quite different perspective. This is truly now a serious field of academic inquiry, and we see evidence of that in the arrival of a Journal of Beatles Study and various study programs at universities.
It is time, past time, for these works to be examined using the same historical methods and standards that are applied to the letters of Winston Churchill, the slave narratives of the Works Progress Administration, and the letters of Cicero.
Erin Torkelson-Weber, The Beatles and the Historians. An analysis of writings about the Fab Four, 2016.
In the view of some authors, the Beatles have been something of a white male discourse for many years. And because of that, we've failed to fully understand the subject matter, because we haven't listened to the individual experience of fans or a more diverse group of people than perhaps the established mainstream writers and speakers, some who are very close to the group and, of course, carry their own particular perspective and incentives.
Obviously, you're a Beatles fan, right? So that's another, the intersection of being a fan and what that means for how you see stuff around the Beatles and then stuff more broadly that happened back then. That's an interesting discourse, isn't it?
at Sydney, you know, or Eric or Dave, somewhere like that.
I just had a thought when you were talking about that, the legitimacy of how much you can be a serious analyst of a particular topic, let's call it the Beatles, if you're also a die-hard fan. You know, is it possible, right? Well, give me a break. Why not? Are you trying to tell me, or these, I know the academics you're talking about, and they're typically male, and they often have a shot at female academics who write stories about the Beatles. Unspoken assumption is that, well, they're a bit emotional, aren't they? And they're not bringing their full reason to bear on this history. The point about this stuff is, are you trying to tell me that historians of Beethoven or historians of Bach were not also fans of their music and couldn't separate their emotional attachment to the music from the rational side of their personality and provide decent analysis? I mean, give me a break. That's one of the fundamental aspects of being human, isn't it? Right, so I've really got no time for this poo-pooing of fans and their ability to understand rationally what was going on at the time about something. It's bullshit.
Well, Frank, look, no doubt the fan experience is genuine. It's what they feel. There's no doubting the legitimacy of that from a personal point of view. How much they meant to them, how much they attached that group, often as a signifier, if you like, of broader social change. But on the question of objectively assessing the impact of that group on the world or broader trends, I think there can be a risk of some fans perhaps losing a bit of objectivity. It's the paradox of expertise, which becomes, as you know, a sort of excuse to reject other narratives. Some ultra fans or super fans, in what I've sometimes referred to as a train spotting category of followers, are just so quick to jump in and correct you on the smallest detail or the smallest mistake. Perhaps you said it was Paul McCartney's 21st birthday when it was his 22nd, those sorts of things. It's that kind of level of ownership of the knowledge that sometimes can trouble me.
Sure.
On and on they go. This reverential large-scale cult is capable of boring even cricket historians and model train enthusiasts. Did you know? McCartney and John Lennon shared a chocolate muffin while writing the second verse of All You Need Is Love. Gary Linnell, Sydney Morning Herald, October 2016.
Yeah, so that's why I've got you here, Frank, because I think in some ways I'm potentially the less objective of the two on this subject. I need you really to play the sort of contrarian viewpoint in this discussion.
Well, that's a big weight to bear. If I talk about some of this stuff, I'll have a ton of, expert academics pulling it apart and talking about what nonsense I've been talking. But that's the name of the game, I guess.
But Frank, even the leading Beatles historian, he's going painstakingly over every single primary document he can get his hands on or track down, or every recording. It's 10 years since he wrote his first edition, and he plans 3, and that was over 1,000 pages, the full edition at least. Even he is subjected to quite sharp competition and contestability. Is he the truly single objective voice on the band?
There are plenty of valid reasons not to automatically put implicit trust in TuneIn, and not to abdicate our own due diligence to Mark Lewison just because he's the acknowledged authority. We can respect him, we can thank him for doing all the work that he's done, we can certainly give him money, which we certainly have.
So we're going to see that this is a fraught area, and I guess the message is that we don't want to be too heavy, we want this to be fun. But at the same time, we are wading into some fascinating territory, one in which their history and the broader context of the 60s itself has, become highly contested and now very much poured over.
The 60s have been merchandised like no other epoch in world history. Most discussions of the 1960s, whatever their earnest historiographical intentions, are contrived exercises in myth-making. The decade has been peddled as a sort of tonic for wilting flower children suffering post-60s neurosis, and prescribed to children anxious to find out what all the fuss is about.
Seizures of Youth, the 60s in Australia, Gerster and Bassetti, 1991.
it becomes a sort of a bit like one of those echo machines where one person's view is then contested and echoes are rebound about what's actually going on. But I think I don't know. This has become a big theme in the whole history field, right? And there's a lot of confusion around what's history and what isn't history. Are there any facts in history? I look at it from a pretty simple point of view. There are historical facts, like, I don't know, we know that Napoleon existed, right? Well, Napoleon existed. I mean, it's so verifiable, and it's a matter of a historical fact. Was he good for France? Oh, of course he was great for France. No, he was terrible for France. That's where the contestability comes in, right? So, and it's because Napoleon wasn't a particle in the universe. He wasn't a physical object. Just he was part of a social structure. We're talking about knowledge about human society, right? And how can I put this? All knowledge about human society is historical knowledge. And so it has to rest upon some form of judgment interpretation. So, we know that this band called the Beatles was around. We know they sold squillions upon squillions of records. We know they lasted for about, 7 or 8 years, and they just dominated the charts. They're sort of historical facts. But anything else over and above that, were they part of their culture? Did they form the culture? All that sort of stuff. Well, that's where the interpretation comes in. And it sort of depends on who's doing it. So your interpretation is going to be different to mine, right? Just by the fact that I'm 8 years older than you, and I was a kid and I remember certain things, and my formative years were a bit earlier than yours, and so my interpretation of that stuff's going to be different to yours. Which is right and which is wrong? A lot of people would say, well, they're both right. I'd say, well, they're both right to a point, but at some point there has to be some sort of verification of my perspective.
Basically, what we've been banging on for a fair while about is what the hell are we doing this for? I mean, it's got like big existential reason for podcast existence. Well, this is kind of a rite of passage, right, to our retirement cohort. 2, it should be something entertaining and engaging, bringing new voices and new anecdotes and new facts to the story by virtue of social media and data collection and joining up of individuals across the world. It's just this, you might say, big data era of the Beatles as well.
If you live in Adelaide, we'll be playing there on June the 12th or the 13th, Melbourne the 15th, 16th, 17th. Okay, well then, we'll turn up. Okay, you'll see how they run the boys like. Anyway, we're going to Sydney, flying to Auckland, Christchurch, then we're either playing at Christchurch or Dunedin, I think. Wellington again, fly to Brisbane. Who's got the ball? In fact, I think we're going to New Zealand as well. That's not enough, is it? No, but it's sort of just off the... When I took the geography, we just sort of things that were... What the... Reefers. They've got reefers all off the west coast, haven't they? That's the pardon.
Technological change has been a critical force here in generating far more raw intelligence, including images, concert footage, press conferences. We've had recordings of the group recently uncovered as perhaps some of the boom generation have been cleaning out their attics during COVID, or discovered some gem in the deceased estate of a family member, or perhaps an autograph that was found on the back of a ticket or a piece of paper long forgotten.
2003, police in England and the Netherlands say that raids they conducted Friday may have unearthed the lost original Beatles recordings. 5 men were arrested.
Featuring the Beatles, late guitarist George Harrison has been uncovered, with experts predicting that the
tapes of never-before-heard recordings and interviews with the Beatles are now up for auction on Gotta Have Rock and Roll. According to the listing, the tapes are comprised of Derek Taylor's
hour-long quarter-inch tape recording was made by student John Bloomfield at Stu Boarding
various
School
vintage
in
tape reels for the news organization's archives. There's often something surprising to be found in old archive material when you scratch the surface, but I never expected to find something of this quality.
When journalist Samira Ahmed paid a visit to Stowe for a doc.
And the truck, a red truck that'll carry the Beatles around past the crowd on several runs. That's the story so far. Back to you, Don.
50 years to the day since the Beatles arrived to mass hysteria, the humbled flatbed that transported them is to be found in perfect working order on a quiet farm in Griffith. At the moment, it's got a water cooler on it, but it still drives beautifully. It only needs a bit of panel work done to it.
A guitar used by John Lennon in the recording of the Beatles album and film Help is going up for auction after being found in a loft. Finding this remarkable instrument is like finding a lost Rembrandt or Picasso, and it still looks and plays like a dream after having been preserved in an attic for more than 50 years, said Darren Julian, co-founder and executive director at auction house Julian's Auctions. To awaken this sleeping beauty is a sacred honour and is a great moment for music, Julian's, Beatles and auction history. Sky News, 24th April 2024.
And now some words from our 1964 sponsors.
Take a pair of ruby lips, take a sparkling porphyry pearl.
Serve sparkling porphyry pearl whenever you celebrate. Sparkling porphyry pearl is a quality wine made by Lindemans by the Champagne method. Buy sparkling porphyry pearl from Metropolitan Bottle Departments for 8 and 6 a large bottle.
Extraordinary scenes continue in Melbourne. A number of teenagers parked and slept in cars outside the Southern Cross in anticipation of their arrival yesterday. Police told me that they discovered these teenagers sleeping in the cars early on Sunday morning.
So that unit of information which is recorded forever, which may have been forgotten, right? In the past it just would have been obliterated. It becomes part of an ongoing reality. It's remembered, so it's reinterpreted. It's like this echo, right? This, which otherwise would never have happened. When Gutenberg developed the printing press, and with the rise of literacy, all of a sudden, someone that had written something this year could be read by someone 10 years hence and became part of this flow of understanding and interpretation and knowledge in a way which couldn't have been the case in the past. And that was a huge game changer. I don't know. Maybe we're entering into something like that now.
I mean, this is now one of our Beatles treasures that can be added to this collection of Beatle material that we hold at the National Sound Archive.
That's the end of our first episode titled Downunder, in which we've explored the themes we'll be looking at over coming weeks. In the next instalment, Tragical History Tour, we're going to go into greater depth on the many new sources of information about the Beatles, podcasts, blogs, YouTube videos, social media, and what that's telling us about their history and how aspects of it are being reinterpreted.
Playing it there. Now here's Alan Lappin at the airport.
Right, thanks, Don. The excitement here is tremendous at the moment. The plane is taxiing across to the landing area. The police are standing by, 4 police courtesy cars.
And as a bit of a teaser and hopefully incentive for you to listen to further episodes, I've been spending quite a bit of time over the summer holidays in the very cool environment of our National Library and Archives, where I've been uncovering and digging through some old sources of information, including discovering a rarely heard interview of John Lennon on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation at the time.
They just said, oh, you've come from up there, have you? You know, as if we were some kind of half-wit. Australia pipped it by, I don't know, by the amount of older people as well that were sort of at airports and standing around the street, which made the Australian reception the biggest we've ever had.
And some really interesting historical documents from those associated with the promotion and organisation of the tour. So there's some reason to stay the course on this podcast. They came to a land down under.
Yeah, Australia. Think of satiric economy with 4 musicians going through it. Hello, Calvert. How's the Wagga Wagga?
I did but see her passing by, and yet I love her till I die.